In 2002, a hospital in North Carolina traced a cluster of mysterious systemic infections back to a single fungus, Exophiala dermatitidis, a black yeast so rare that most doctors had never encountered it outside a textbook. The women who fell ill had received contaminated steroid injections, and the pathogen that nearly killed them was one that thrives in warm, wet, enclosed spaces. 9 years later, microbiologists at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia went looking for that same organism, not in hospitals, but in ordinary homes. They found it in a place no one expected. They found it growing on the rubber seals inside household dishwashers, in kitchens on 6 continents. That discovery set off a chain of peer-reviewed research that quietly reshaped what scientists understand about everyday household hygiene. And at the center of the solution sits a white crystalline powder that costs about $1. A powder so simple, so unpatentable, and so effective that no major corporation has ever had a financial reason to tell you about it. Today, we are going to walk through the science, the history, and the exact step-by-step protocol that could change the way you maintain your kitchen. Stay with me through the end of this video, because what you learn here might save you hundreds of dollars a year and protect the health of the people you feed every single day. Let us get into it. Part 1. How the modern kitchen forgot the old rules. Before we talk about solutions, we have to understand how the problem was built. And for that, we need to go back to the middle of the 20th century. In the early 1950s, residential dishwashers began appearing in American kitchens. Companies like General Electric, Hotpoint, and Frigidaire poured money into advertising campaigns that promised a revolution. The pitch was clever and deeply psychological. Machines are more hygienic than human hands. Your dishes deserve better than your touch. The message landed. By 1970, roughly 30% of American households owned a dishwasher. By the early 2020s, that number had crossed 80%. The appliance industry had successfully merged 2 ideas into one product: convenience and cleanliness. But here is what the advertisements never mentioned. For thousands of years before the dishwasher existed, people maintained their kitchens using principles passed down through generations. They cleaned with vinegar and lemon juice. They understood that acid dissolves mineral buildup. They knew that damp, dark spaces breed trouble unless you actively manage them. Those skills were not glamorous, but they worked. The mid-century appliance boom did something subtle and consequential. It did not just automate a chore. It severed a thread of practical knowledge that had been handed down for centuries. People stopped thinking about how cleaning actually works at a chemical level because they were told they no longer needed to. And in that gap between old knowledge and new convenience, a problem quietly took root. Part 2. The engineering contradiction nobody talks about. Think about what a dishwasher actually is, from a purely physical standpoint. It is a sealed metal or plastic box. It fills with hot water, blasts detergent across your dishes for 60 to 90 minutes, drains, and then sits closed. The cycle ends, your dishes look clean, you walk away. But inside that closed box, the temperature drops to roughly 80 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Moisture clings to every interior surface. Microscopic food particles, invisible to the naked eye, settle into the filter at the bottom of the tub, a filter that the majority of dishwasher owners have never cleaned, and many do not even know exists. For the next 12 to 24 hours, until you run another load, the interior of your dishwasher becomes something its designers never intended: a biological incubator. It is warm, it is dark, it is wet, and it is full of organic nutrients. This is not speculation. This is the conclusion of some of the most rigorous microbiology research published in the last 2 decades. Part 3. What the scientists found. Inside 189 dishwashers. In 2011, a team of microbiologists led by Polona Zaller and Nina Gundi-Zimmermann at the University of Ljubljana published a study in the British journal Fungal Biology that attracted attention around the world. They swathed the rubber door seals of 189 residential dishwashers collected from private homes in 101 towns and communities across 6 continents: Europe, North and South America, Israel, South Africa, East Asia, and Australia. The results were striking. 62% of the dishwashers tested positive for fungi. Among those, 56% harbored a specific organism, Exophiala dermatitidis, a polyextremotolerant black yeast. In nature, this species is rarely found, but inside the artificial environment of a dishwasher, with its cycles of heat, moisture, detergent, and organic residue, Exophiala had found an ideal habitat. Why does this matter? Exophiala dermatitidis is classified as an opportunistic human pathogen. It is known to colonize the lungs of patients with cystic fibrosis. In East Asia, it has caused fatal brain infections in otherwise healthy, immunocompetent individuals. The researchers at Ljubljana described this pattern as a migration of black yeasts into human domestic environments and flagged it as a potential health concern that warranted further investigation. And further investigation is exactly what followed. In 2016, the same research group published a follow-up study, this time examining 9 different locations inside each of 30 residential dishwashers. The findings were even more dramatic. 83% of the machines tested positive for fungi. Exophiala dermatitidis was detected in 47% of the dishwashers, primarily on the rubber seals, at concentrations reaching up to 1 million colony-forming units per square centimeter. But the fungi were not alone. Using DNA sequencing, the researchers mapped the bacterial biofilm communities growing inside these machines. They identified Pseudomonas, a genus associated with pneumonia. They found Acinetobacter, a leading cause of antibiotic-resistant hospital infections. And they found Escherichia, the family that includes the infamous E. coli. Perhaps most unsettling, the 2016 study demonstrated that the dishwasher was not just harboring these organisms, it was actively dispersing them. When the warm dishwasher door opened after a cycle, hot aerosols carried fungal spores and bacterial cells into the kitchen air. The study found that kitchens containing dishwashers had significantly higher levels of Exophiala dermatitidis compared to kitchens without one. The machine designed to sanitize was, in effect, seeding the room where families prepare food. Part 4. The Invisible Fortress. Why your detergent is not enough. If you are thinking that your expensive dish detergent should handle these organisms, the science explains exactly why it does not. The microbes inside your dishwasher do not float around loosely, waiting to be washed away. They build biofilms. A biofilm is a structured colony of microorganisms encased in a self-produced protective matrix, a kind of biological concrete made of proteins, polysaccharides, and extracellular DNA. This matrix shields the organisms inside from detergent, from heat, and even from bleach. Published research across multiple peer-reviewed journals has established that bacteria living inside a biofilm can be 10 to 1,000 times more resistant to antimicrobial agents than the exact same bacteria floating freely in water. Your dishwasher detergent kills what is suspended in the wash water during a cycle, but the biofilm anchored to the rubber gasket, the plastic interior walls, and the hidden filter simply endures. And here is the critical detail that connects the biology to the chemistry. These biofilms do not attach directly to plastic or rubber. They anchor themselves to a foundation of mineral deposits, calcium and magnesium scale left behind by your tap water. Every wash cycle deposits a thin layer of these minerals. Over months and years, that layer builds into a hard, crusty scaffold. The biofilm grows on top of it, into it, and through it. The mineral scale is the skeleton. The biofilm is the living tissue wrapped around it. This is why bleach alone fails. Bleach can kill the surface layer of mold on contact, but it does nothing to dissolve the mineral scaffolding underneath. Within weeks, the mold grows back because its foundation was never removed. You killed the leaves, but left the roots intact. Part 5. Why the simplest solution has no billboard. Now here's the question worth sitting with for a moment. If scientists published these findings over a decade ago, why is this not common knowledge? The answer has less to do with conspiracy and more to do with economics. Citric acid is the substance that dissolves mineral scale, destroys the scaffolding that biofilms depend on, and restores a dishwasher to clean operating condition. It is a naturally occurring organic acid found in lemons, limes, and grapefruits. You can buy food-grade citric acid powder at a grocery store, on Amazon, or at Walmart for roughly $1 to $2 per bag. The problem, from an industry perspective, is that citric acid cannot be patented. No single company owns it. No brand can claim exclusive rights to a molecule that exists in every lemon on Earth. And that creates a structural economic gap. There is no corporate champion with a financial incentive to advertise it, market it, or educate the public about it. Compare that to branded dishwasher cleaner pods, which retail for $8 to $15 per box. If you read the ingredient labels on many of those products, you will find that the primary active cleaning agent is citric acid, repackaged with fragrances, dyes, and a dissolvable plastic shell. This is not a case of the industry deliberately hiding something. It is a case of simple market economics. Products with high margins get marketing budgets. Generic commodities do not. The result is the same for the consumer. The cheapest and most effective solution sits on the shelf in plain sight, while the branded version gets the advertising. Meanwhile, dishwasher manufacturers design machines with filters that trap food debris, but the maintenance instructions are buried deep in manuals that most owners never read. When the machine starts smelling or underperforming, the typical response is a service call costing $150 to $300. And what does the technician do? They pull out a clogged filter, wipe down the gasket, and run a hot cycle with a descaling agent, a 10-minute task using about $1 worth of materials. Even General Electric, one of the largest dishwasher manufacturers in the world, quietly recommends citric acid crystals for cleaning dishwasher interiors. The recommendation appears in their official support documentation, not on any billboard or television commercial. Part 6. The chemistry behind the $1 solution. So what exactly makes citric acid so effective? The science is elegant and well understood. Patrick Holland, the Conkey P. Whitehead Professor of Chemistry at Yale University, has explained the mechanism in straightforward terms. Citric acid is a powerful chelating agent. Chelation is a chemical process in which a molecule binds tightly to metal ions and pulls them out of their solid structure. In the case of your dishwasher, citric acid grabs the calcium and magnesium ions that make up hard water scale and dissolves them into the water. When the mineral scaffold dissolves, the biofilm anchored to it loses its foundation. The organisms that depended on that structure, the black yeast, the bacteria, the fungal colonies, are exposed and washed away. Citric acid attacks both the organism and the infrastructure the organism lives on. That is why the results are so much more durable than bleach, which only addresses the surface layer. You might ask, why not just use white vinegar? Vinegar is acetic acid, which is significantly weaker than citric acid. It does not achieve the low pH needed to break through established mineral scale or dense biofilm. Additionally, acetic acid can degrade rubber gaskets over time, potentially leading to cracks and water leaks. Citric acid is gentler on those rubber components while being far more effective against the mineral deposits. What about baking soda? Baking soda is a base, the chemical opposite of an acid. It cannot dissolve mineral deposits. It has its uses in cleaning, but descaling is not one of them. Part 7. An honest look at the branded alternatives. Before we move to the step-by-step protocol, let me be fair to the branded products for a moment. Branded dishwasher cleaner pods are not worthless. They offer pre-measured convenience. Some include rinse aids and surfactants that provide additional benefits beyond what pure citric acid delivers. For someone who wants a simple, grab-and-go option and does not mind paying a premium for packaging and convenience, the branded pods work. The point is not that those products are a scam. The point is that the active descaling ingredient doing the heavy lifting in most of them is the same citric acid you can buy for a fraction of the price. If you are comfortable measuring a few tablespoons of powder, you can achieve the same core cleaning result for roughly 1/20th the cost. That is a choice worth knowing you have. Part 8. The complete maintenance protocol. Here is the exact step-by-step process to deep clean your dishwasher and restore it to peak condition. Every step uses common tools and costs almost nothing. Step 1. The hidden filter. Open your dishwasher and look at the bottom of the tub. You will see a cylindrical filter screen. Twist it counterclockwise and pull it straight up. If you have never done this, be prepared. It is likely coated in a layer of decomposing food residue. Rinse it under hot running water and scrub it with an old toothbrush and a drop of dish soap until it is completely clean. Step 2. The rubber gasket. Pull open the rubber door seal along the entire rim of the machine. Fold it back gently. Mix a tablespoon of citric acid with a small amount of warm water to form a paste. Use a soft cloth to wipe every inch of that gasket. The dark, slimy residue that comes off on your cloth is the biofilm and mold that has been building up over months. Step 3. The spray arms. Check the rotating spray arms at the top and bottom of the interior. If the tiny holes are clogged with white mineral crust or food particles, remove the arms. Most twist or pop off easily. Soak them in a basin of warm water mixed with 3 tablespoons of citric acid for 20 to 30 minutes. Use a toothpick to clear each individual hole until water flows freely through every opening. Reattach them. Step 4. The purging cycle. Place 3 to 4 tablespoons of food-grade citric acid powder into the main detergent dispenser cup. Close the cup. Make sure the dishwasher is completely empty. Run the machine on the hottest and longest cycle available. As the cycle runs, the citric acid will chelate and dissolve the mineral deposits throughout the spray arms, along the interior walls, on the heating element, and through every hose and pump connection. When the cycle finishes, open the door. Run one more quick normal cycle with your regular detergent to flush any loosened debris down the drain. Repeat this treatment once every 30 days. A single bag of citric acid will last most households 6 months to a year. Part 9. When this is not enough. Honest limitations. Citric acid is exceptional for preventative maintenance and routine descaling, but it is not a magic fix for everything. Here is when you need something more. If your dishwasher has a mechanically broken pump, a cracked hose, or a malfunctioning heating element, no amount of citric acid will solve that. Those are hardware failures that require professional repair. If mold has physically penetrated the rubber gasket material itself, turning it spongy, discolored, or cracked, the gasket may need to be replaced entirely. Citric acid removes surface biofilm and scale, but it cannot restore degraded rubber. If you have extremely hard water, a single citric acid treatment may not remove years of accumulated scale. You may need to run 2 or 3 consecutive cycles before seeing full results, and you should consider installing a water softener for long-term protection. And if anyone in your household is immunocompromised, has cystic fibrosis, or has a chronic respiratory condition, the dishwasher research we discussed today carries extra relevance. In those cases, more frequent maintenance, professional cleaning, and consultation with a physician about household environmental hygiene are all worth considering. Citric acid is a tool, an excellent tool. But like any tool, it works best when you understand both its strengths and its limits. Part 10. The deeper lesson. We started this story in a North Carolina hospital in 2002, where a rare black yeast nearly killed patients through contaminated injections. A decade later, scientists found that same organism thriving inside ordinary household dishwashers on 6 continents. The gap between those two facts contains a lesson that goes well beyond kitchen maintenance. We live in an era that encourages us to outsource our understanding of the world to brands, to machines, to experts. And most of the time, those systems work fine. But when they fail, the people who recover fastest are the ones who still carry a baseline of practical knowledge, the kind of knowledge that used to be passed down at kitchen tables and workbenches. Your ancestors did not have branded pods or subscription cleaning services. They had observation, experimentation, and the accumulated wisdom of generations who learned what worked and passed it forward. Citric acid does not care whether it is wrapped in a branded plastic shell or scooped from a plain paper bag. The molecule does the same job either way. Take a look around your home. What other expensive branded solutions are just simple, well-understood remedies in different packaging? What other machines are quietly accumulating problems that 10 minutes of informed maintenance could prevent? The past holds more practical wisdom than we give it credit for. And sometimes, the most powerful solution is the one that is too simple and too cheap for anyone to bother selling to you. Thank you for watching ORACLEprime. If this video opened your eyes to something you did not know, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive. And remember, the best defense against the modern world is understanding how it actually works. Until next time.